The fields of South Carolina remember everything. When the wind drifts low through the cypress, it carries more than the smell of wet earth. It carries a hum, soft and broken, like a lullaby sung through cracked teeth. Locals say that if you listen long enough, you can still hear her voice, the blind girl with hair as pale as milk, calling for the son she should never have had. In the summer of 1823, the air over Whitmore Plantation hung heavy with the scent of sugarcane and something far less pure. Silas Whitmore stood at the edge of his fields, watching the enslaved men move in lines through the stalks, their backs glistening beneath the sun, their eyes empty from generations of labor that began long before they were born. To most, the land was a place of torment. To Silas, it was a cathedral. He believed the soil spoke to him, that God himself had chosen him to build something everlasting from its red, rich clay. He fancied himself a prophet, though the Bible he clutched was warped with sweat and the pages stuck together from years of use, the words barely legible beneath his trembling fingers. When Eleanor was born, Silas thought she was a divine blessing, proof that heaven had smiled upon him. But when the midwife whispered that the child's eyes would never see, his faith twisted into something monstrous. Blindness, to him, was not a flaw of nature but a mark of spiritual imperfection, a stain upon his bloodline. And so, as the years passed, he turned his shame into obsession. He studied the scriptures not for comfort but for justification, searching for some secret verse that might explain how a man could forge perfection from imperfection. When he could not find it, he decided to write his own gospel, one built on the flesh of those who could not defy him. The slaves of Whitmore Plantation began to notice the change in their master long before anyone dared to speak of it. He stopped attending Sunday service, claiming the church had grown soft, too forgiving. He spent his nights pacing the halls of the big house, murmuring to himself, his boots thudding like a heartbeat on the wooden floors. The servant said he spoke to the walls, that he prayed not to God but to something else, something older, something that answered only when the wind turned still and the air grew cold. Eleanor grew into a quiet woman, pale and delicate, with an otherworldly calm that unsettled those around her. She never left the estate. Her father said the world was too cruel for her kind. Her only companions were the sounds of the wind in the cane and the hymns her mother had once sung before she died giving birth. But the songs Eleanor sang were not hymns. They were strange, wordless melodies that made the dogs howl at night and the birds fall silent in the morning. It was around that time Silas began his experiments. He called it purification. He selected 11 of his strongest enslaved men, bodies hardened by labor, eyes dulled by despair, and took them from the fields under the cover of darkness. None of them returned to their quarters. They were brought to a locked cabin behind the stables, where the windows were boarded and the door was chained shut from the outside. Some said they could hear chanting from within, others claimed they heard a woman crying, but no one dared investigate. Fear had long become the language of the plantation. Eleanor's blindness, Silas said, was a divine challenge. He believed that through her, he could birth a being untouched by corruption, a child with her purity and the strength of the men he despised yet depended upon. To him, the act was not sin but sacrifice. In his fevered mind, the merging of opposites would create balance, harmony, a creature closer to God than to man. He told himself he was chosen for this purpose, that the blood of the enslaved carried something ancient, a strength born of suffering that his own blood lacked. For weeks, the cabin's windows glowed faintly at night, like lanterns flickering beneath the trees. The overseer refused to go near it. Even the dogs whimpered and pulled away when brought close. One morning, the fields were empty. The 11 men were gone, and Eleanor was nowhere to be seen. Silas emerged alone from the cabin, his face gaunt and gray, his hands trembling, clutching his Bible like a weapon. He announced to no one in particular that the seed had been planted, and that soon, all of Carolina would bear witness to his work. The slaves whispered that something had gone terribly wrong. They said the girl screamed for 3 days straight, that thunder rolled across the fields though no storm came. Some claimed they saw shadows moving inside the house long after the candles went out, shapes too large and too many to belong to just one man or woman. Whatever happened in that cabin became the plantation's darkest secret, sealed in whispers and prayers, buried in the soil that drank too much blood to ever be clean again. The 12th birth came during a storm that no one remembered starting. The air was so thick with heat that it felt alive, trembling against the skin, and the sky pressed low over the Whitmore Plantation, swollen and bruised with clouds that refused to break. Inside the big house, every candle had been lit, but the light seemed to bend away from the walls, retreating as though afraid of what it might reveal. Eleanor lay in her father's bed, her body weak and frail from the weight of 11 deaths before this one. The midwives were gone. None would come after what had happened last time, so Silas stood alone beside her, his Bible open, his voice shaking as he whispered a prayer that sounded more like a command. He had told the remaining servants that this would be the final test, that God himself had promised him a sign. But those who overheard the prayers said they did not sound like prayers at all. They said Silas was begging something older than God, something buried deep in the soil beneath his feet. The storm outside seemed to respond, roaring low and distant, and the windows rattled as if the house itself were breathing. Eleanor's cries echoed through the halls, sharp and hollow, and with each scream, the wind outside grew stronger, shaking the trees until their branches cracked like whips. By midnight, the rain began to fall, not water, but thick, dark streaks that stained the window panes like ink. The few servants who dared peek outside said it smelled like iron, heavy and metallic, and it steamed when it hit the ground. Inside, Eleanor's voice faded into silence. For a moment, there was nothing, no sound but the whisper of the storm and the rhythmic thump of Silas's boots on the floorboards as he paced back and forth, muttering scripture under his breath. Then, from the bed, came a sound that no one had ever heard before. It was not a baby's cry. It was deeper, older, as though the world itself had drawn in a breath for the first time. When the door opened at dawn, the house was cold. The storm had passed, leaving behind a stillness so complete it made the ears ring. The servants who had gathered at the base of the stairs saw Silas standing in the doorway, his hands red to the wrists, his face lit with something that looked like awe and terror all at once. He said nothing as he carried the newborn down the steps, wrapped in a sheet that moved faintly, as though the thing inside it did not know how to be still. No one could see its face. Silas forbade them to look. He told them only that it was perfect, that the prophecy had been fulfilled, that his legacy had begun. Eleanor never spoke again. She lay in that bed for days, pale and quiet, her lips cracked from fever. Those who brought her food said she turned her face toward the wall and whispered names no one recognized, names that made the lamps flicker and the dogs bark through the night. Some claimed they saw her smile in her sleep, though her eyes were wet with tears. Others said she begged to hold her child, but Silas refused, saying it was not hers to touch. It belonged to something greater now. In the days that followed, the plantation began to change. The crops grew too fast, their roots bursting through the soil like veins. The well water turned thick and dark, and the animals refused to drink from it. The air took on a strange sweetness that made people lightheaded. One night, a field hand swore he saw something moving between the rows of cane, something small, crawling on all fours, leaving a trail of steam in the dirt where it passed. He told no one until morning, when they found the dogs dead, their mouths foaming and their eyes wide open, staring toward the big house. Silas kept the child hidden from the world. He built a locked room in the basement, lined the walls with scripture, and forbade anyone to enter. But at night, those who worked the ground said they heard sounds coming from below, soft, rhythmic thuds, as if tiny fists were beating against stone. Sometimes there was laughter, faint and echoing, too deep for a child's voice. The smell of rot began to drift through the house, though no source could be found. Weeks later, Eleanor's window was found open. Her bed was empty. Silas searched the grounds for 3 days, calling her name through the fields, but only the wind answered. When he returned to the basement, the door was unlatched. The Bible he had nailed above the entrance lay open on the floor, its pages soaked with something dark. Inside, the child was gone, but the walls were covered in handprints, hundreds of them, some small, some large, pressed deep into the wood as though the boards themselves had softened for their touch. From that night on, the river that cut through Whitmore Plantation ran slower, its surface coated in a sheen that caught the moonlight like oil. The men refused to fish from it, and the women refused to draw water. Whatever had been born in that room had not died. It had gone into the land, into the air, into the roots of Carolina itself, where it began to hum softly, waiting for someone to listen. When the child turned 5, the air over Whitmore Plantation thickened again, the same way it had the night he was born. The sky seemed to hold its breath, and the cicadas stopped singing. Those who still worked the field said it felt like standing inside a throat, warm, damp, and waiting for a voice. Silas had changed in those 5 years, though time alone couldn't explain the decay that crept over him. His hair had turned white, his hands shook even when he tried to hold them still, and his eyes had grown so pale they looked blind. Yet he still moved through the house with the same grim authority, clutching his cane and muttering to himself as if arguing with something only he could see. The boy was never far behind him. The child did not speak often. When he did, his voice carried an odd weight, too measured for his age, too knowing. The servant said he could recite scripture word for word, though no one had ever taught him to read. He wandered the halls at night, silent as a shadow, and the candles would gutter when he passed. Eleanor's absence hung heavy in the air, no one dared mention her name. But sometimes, in the dark hours before dawn, a faint melody would drift through the halls, the same song she used to hum to herself before she disappeared. It always stopped the moment Silas opened his door. Strange things began to happen on the plantation. The crops grew in unnatural patterns, twisting toward the house as if reaching for something. The livestock grew restless, kicking their stalls until their hooves split. One by one, the dogs vanished, their collars found days later at the edge of the swamp. The boy seemed untouched by it all. He spent his days sitting in the field, his small hands buried in the soil, whispering softly. When Silas asked what he was saying, the boy simply replied, "They're listening." One night, the sky turned the color of old bruises, and the wind brought with it the smell of something burnt. The workers gathered on the porch, afraid to go inside, because the house itself had begun to groan. It was a low, steady sound, like a living thing shifting in its sleep. From the cracks in the walls, thick sap began to seep, a dark, syrupy ooze that smelled faintly of sweetness and decay. The wood absorbed it, and the floors became sticky underfoot. Silas ordered the servants to clean it, but every morning it returned, thicker than before. The boy watched it all with calm fascination. He would trace his fingers along the walls, tasting the residue that bled from the boards. When Silas struck his hand away, the boy only smiled. That same night, the plantation fell silent. The crickets, the frogs, even the wind itself stopped. For hours, the world held still. Then, without warning, a sound like a single breath rushed through the fields, and every animal on the property fell dead where it stood. Horses collapsed mid-step, their eyes glassy and wide. Chickens dropped in their coops. Even the insects vanished. Silas found the boy standing in the field at dawn, barefoot and clean, his nightshirt unstained despite the mud. Around him, the bodies of dead crows littered the ground, their wings stretched as if in offering. The boy looked up at his father and said they wanted to rest. His tone was gentle, almost kind, but his eyes, those pale, milky eyes, were not human. Silas felt something twist inside him then, a realization too late to undo. Whatever he had tried to create, whatever divine perfection he had sought, it was no child of God that now bore his name. That evening, he locked himself in his study, filling pages with frantic handwriting. The servants could hear him muttering prayers and tearing at the walls, demanding answers from a silent heaven. The boy wandered the halls, humming the same tune his mother once sang, though slower, stretched out, like something unraveling. When the lamps flickered, shadows seemed to bend toward him, curling around his small frame before melting back into the dark. By morning, smoke rose from the edges of the fields. No one saw the fire start, yet the cane burned from root to tip, and the air smelled of scorched honey. The workers tried to flee, but the gates refused to open, the hinges had melted like wax. Inside the house, the boy stood by the window, watching it all with calm delight, while behind him, the walls pulsed faintly, as if breathing. Silas stumbled into the hall, his Bible clutched tight, shouting words no one could understand. When the flames reached the porch, the house shuddered once, a deep groan that rolled through its foundation. The sap that had bled from the walls began to boil, dripping onto the floor like molten tar. The servants who escaped said they heard laughter echoing through the smoke, not a man's laughter, not a child's either, but something caught between the two. By dawn, the fire had burned itself out, leaving only the stone shell of the Whitmore mansion standing in the ash. The boy was nowhere to be found, and Silas's Bible lay open in the dirt, its pages fused together, the words lost forever. The ruins of Whitmore Plantation stood for months after the fire, black and skeletal against the horizon, the chimneys jutting from the ash like grave markers. The few who survived refused to return, but the land had a pull that felt almost human. Smoke no longer rose from the fields, yet the scent of burning lingered, seeping into the soil and the water. Some said the fire had never gone out, that it only sank deeper, smoldering beneath the ground, feeding on the roots of the cane. Others said they still saw lights moving through the trees at night, flickering shapes that whispered when the wind turned. Silas Whitmore did not leave. He refused. The plantation, he said, was not dead. It was changing, becoming what it was always meant to be. He sent word for his men to return, promising double wages and divine protection, but only a handful obeyed, and those who did came back hollow-eyed, mumbling that the house breathed and the fields whispered. The boy was still there, though none could say where he slept. He wandered the property barefoot, his feet never dirty, his head tilted slightly as if listening to something buried beneath the earth. Silas followed him everywhere, his Bible now nothing more than a charm he carried for comfort, the words inside burned beyond recognition. His once booming voice had thinned to a rasp, his body wasting away with each passing day, but his faith in his creation burned brighter than ever. He believed his son was proof that the human form could be remade, that through sin came perfection, and through pain came eternity. The slaves who had escaped in the chaos of the fire spread word across the neighboring plantations. They said the Whitmore child was not a boy at all but a thing made of ash and blood, that its shadow walked separate from its body and that its laughter drove men mad. For weeks, small groups ventured back toward the estate to see what was left. None returned. The few who dared to pass near the property claimed they saw Silas standing by the gate at dusk, speaking softly into the air, as if negotiating with the wind. When he turned, his eyes were gone, only deep hollows left behind, yet he moved with certainty, as though he no longer needed them. One night, thunder rolled across the horizon though no storm followed. The workers from nearby farms said they saw torches weaving through the trees, the silhouettes of men moving toward the plantation, led by Silas and his hunting dogs. They said he was searching for the runaways, determined to bring them back, convinced that their flight had cursed his land. The dogs' howls echoed deep into the woods, rising and falling until they stopped all at once, cut short by something too sharp to be natural. Then came silence. When morning arrived, no one dared to go after them, but by noon the wind shifted, carrying with it a foul sweetness, the smell of something rotting beneath the magnolias. Days later, a search party from the nearby town stumbled upon the remains of the hunt. The forest floor was littered with bones, some animal, some not, all stripped clean, as if the meat had evaporated. Silas's rifle lay in the mud beside a tattered coat, and the dogs' collars were scattered in a perfect circle around a hollow tree. From inside the trunk came a low humming, faint but steady, the same sound that once haunted the Whitmore fields. When the men split the tree open with an axe, black sap poured out, thick as oil, and inside they found a man's body fused to the wood, his skin and bark intertwined, his mouth open in a silent scream. What made them flee, though, was the thing cradled in his arms, a small figure with pale hair and closed eyes, its skin unburned, its chest rising and falling with the rhythm of sleep. By dusk, the ruins of the Whitmore estate had vanished beneath a new growth of moss and vine, as if the land had swallowed it whole. The search party swore they saw the fields moving, the cane bending and twisting in waves, though there was no wind. They left before nightfall, but one man stayed long enough to see a figure step out from the shadows of the house that should no longer exist. It was the boy, still 5 years old, his face unchanged, his hands stained black. He looked toward the men and smiled, and in that moment every insect in the forest began to sing at once, a shrill, endless chorus that followed them all the way back to town. In the weeks that followed, the river near the plantation turned red. Fish floated to the surface, and the trees along the bank began to wilt, their roots rising like bones from the soil. People whispered that Silas Whitmore had made a pact with something that refused to let him die, that the woods themselves had taken his place, that his voice still echoed in the leaves. Those who listened too long said they could hear the boy's laughter underneath it, faint but constant, as if the two had become one, father and son, flesh and earth, bound together beneath the ruins of Carolina. Years passed, and the story of the Whitmore Plantation became more rumor than record, a whispered warning traded in taverns and around campfires by those who claimed to have known someone who had seen the ruins. Time smoothed over the horror, or tried to, but the land never forgot. Nothing grew right in that part of South Carolina anymore. The soil stayed dark and damp even in summer, and the air always carried the scent of something old and sweet, like fruit left too long on the vine. New settlers came and went, trying to build homes, trying to tame the ground that had swallowed the Whitmores whole, but their crops failed, their wells soured, and their children began to talk to things no one else could see. The county clerk stopped approving deeds for that land after a while, not out of law but superstition. They said the curse followed blood. The last of the Whitmore name had left behind no gravestone, no proof of burial, yet rumors spread that Eleanor's child had not died at all, that it had grown into something that could not be measured by years. Those who believed swore that the child, or the thing that had been called a child, moved from place to place beneath the earth, feeding on memory, on sorrow, on anything that resembled family. It didn't kill quickly, it settled into the roots of towns like rot under the skin, patient, silent, inevitable. Wherever whispers of the Whitmore name surfaced, sickness followed. First came the insects, thick clouds of them that blackened the air. Then the water would thicken, and the people would start to lose their minds. By the 1870s, the land where the plantation once stood had become a swamp. The river changed course on its own, swallowing roads and homes that no storm had touched. Surveyors who mapped the region said their compasses spun wildly when they crossed that ground, and one man returned to town barefoot, mumbling about eyes in the water that looked up but never blinked. Children from nearby farms went missing, their footprints ending at the edge of the reeds, and at night, families heard laughter drifting across the marsh, soft, high, and far too close. Locals began to call it Carolina's heart, though they meant it as a curse. No birds nested there, no animals crossed through. Even the trees grew wrong, bent backward as if reaching toward something buried. Travelers who strayed too far into the swamp said they found remnants of brick walls slick with moss, fragments of porcelain dolls, rusted silver spoons half sunk in the mud. Some swore they saw a house deep in the fog, its windows faintly glowing, its door open just enough to see the shape of someone standing inside, still and waiting. Those who saw it and turned away sometimes woke the next morning with black dirt under their fingernails and the taste of ash on their tongues. By the turn of the century, people stopped talking about the Whitmores, but the curse didn't fade. Small towns in that region began to die in strange ways. Wells dried without warning, leaving behind a residue that burned to the touch. Entire families were found asleep in their homes, unbreathing but unrotted, their faces calm, as though they'd simply forgotten to wake. Churches crumbled from the inside out, their wood eaten away by some slow, unseen decay. Those who studied the phenomenon said it was just the swamp reclaiming what was left of civilization, but the locals knew better. They said the bloodline had spread, Eleanor's descendants scattered across the state, carrying the seed of their family's sin within them. Wherever they settled, the land eventually turned to ruin. By 1912, there were entire counties abandoned, their maps erased, their histories rewritten. Only the oldest residents remembered why no one built near those woods, and they spoke of it only after dark, when the wind shifted and the air turned still. They said the curse was no longer a single place or name, it was in the soil itself, in the dust that blew through Carolina's fields, in the bones that fed the grass. They said the child that Silas Whitmore made in defiance of God had grown beyond flesh, that it no longer needed a body to move, that it had become the land. Sometimes, on nights when the moon was low and the mist hung over the river like breath, travelers claimed they could see a figure moving through the fog. A child's shape at first glance, though its shadow stretched far too long behind it. It hummed softly, a broken tune that made the water ripple and the air taste of metal. Those who followed the sound were never found. The next morning, new vines would rise where they had stood, their stems black as ink, their roots twisted deep into the earth, as though the ground itself was hungry. And so the stories spread, passed down like warnings carved into the memory of Carolina, that something born of sin and silence still lived beneath its soil, and that the land itself would never stop feeding on its own history.